What does it mean when a bright idea disappears? Not just forgotten, not simply outpaced by newer machines, but erased so thoroughly that what remains feels more like rumor than history. Somewhere between the archive and the ash heap, between memory and myth, there are stories that refuse to settle. Stories of inventions that seem to arrive too early, speak too boldly, or ask questions the world was not prepared to answer. Across the last century, men and women in workshops, laboratories, warehouses, and lonely garages claimed to glimpse another future. A world with cleaner air, longer-lasting tools, engines that consumed less, power that moved more freely. In some cases, their devices were demonstrated in public. In others, they were patented, funded, praised, and then quietly abandoned. The pattern is what lingers. A breakthrough appears. Interest gathers. Then something changes. Funding disappears. Records thin out. Prototypes vanish. The people at the center of it all are dismissed, discredited, or left standing alone beside the wreckage of their own ambition. It is tempting to turn such stories into simple legends, to sort them neatly into truth or delusion, genius or error. But history is rarely that obedient. Sometimes an invention fails because it was flawed. Sometimes it fails because the world around it was not ready. And sometimes the line between those two explanations becomes impossible to trace. This is not a story about perfect machines or secret certainties. It is a story about human longing, about the persistent belief that life could be made lighter, cleaner, fairer, more enduring. It is also a story about power. Who gets to decide which ideas survive, which futures are funded, and which are left to flicker in the dark? Because every lost invention leaves behind the same haunting question. Did it vanish because it could never work, or because it might have changed everything? What if the future first arrived as something almost laughably simple, a glass of water beside an engine? In the late 1990s, in a quiet corner of Ohio, inventor Stanley Meyer stood beside a modified vehicle and offered a claim so bold it seemed to bend the air around it. He believed water, the most ordinary substance on Earth, could become fuel. Not in some distant century, but now. To his supporters, Meyer was not selling fantasy. He had patents, diagrams, and a machine that appeared to run. He spoke with the certainty of a man who had spent too many nights alone with wires, valves, and voltage, chasing a pattern no one else could yet see. The idea was as seductive as it was destabilizing. Split water into its elemental parts with unusual efficiency, release hydrogen, feed an engine, and leave behind little more than vapor and disbelief. And disbelief came quickly. Scientists challenged the math. Engineers questioned the energy balance. Critics said the machine asked the laws of physics to make an exception, yet curiosity followed him anyway. Investors listened. Foreign delegations watched. Cameras recorded a buggy moving down the road under a cloud of possibility. For a moment, the invention seemed to hover between ridicule and revolution. Then the story broke apart. Meyer died suddenly after a meeting with investors, collapsing in a restaurant parking lot under circumstances that would invite speculation for decades. Official explanations closed the file, but not the questions. The prototype disappeared from public life. The workshop emptied. The surviving plans seemed incomplete, as though the most important sentence had been torn from the page. Maybe the machine was flawed. Maybe it was misunderstood. Or maybe what unsettled people was not the device itself, but what it represented. A world where power might come from what falls freely from the scarso. And when an idea seems to promise too much, do we reject it because it is false, or because it asks us to imagine life reordered from the ground up? How does an invention disappear in plain sight? Sometimes not with fire or scandal, but with silence. In the 1920s, a French inventor named Georges Claude lit the world with neon, turning city streets into glowing rivers of color. Yet beyond the signs and spectacle, he was chasing something far less decorative and far more consequential, a way to draw power from the temperature difference in the sea. The principle was elegant. Warm surface water and cold deep water could be used to drive a heat engine, creating electricity from the ocean's own layered breath. Today we would call it ocean thermal energy conversion. But to Claude and others working in that early era, it was more than a technical scheme. It was a vision of power born not from smoke or mines, but from the patient movement of the planet itself. He built prototypes. Tests were conducted. The concept proved it could function, at least in part. But proof is not the same as survival. The engineering was punishing, the costs enormous, the infrastructure fragile in the face of storms, salt, and distance. Traditional fuels remained easier to move, easier to finance, easier to defend. The ocean, for all its generosity, demanded patience on an industrial scale. So the idea drifted to the margins, not disproven, not entirely abandoned, just left in a kind of historical twilight. It survived in papers, in experiments, in occasional bursts of renewed interest whenever energy crises reminded humanity that convenience has a price. What vanished was not the science, but the momentum. The feeling that this path, too, might have led somewhere transformative if the world had chosen to keep walking. There is a peculiar sadness in inventions like this. They are not lost because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient in an age that rewarded speed. The ocean kept its secret in full view, waves arriving as they always had, while the human world looked elsewhere for answers. And that may be one of history's quietest lessons. Some ideas do not fail because nature refuses them, but because civilization lacks the patience to grow into them. Can a machine be too durable for its own good? In the middle years of the 20th century, long before sustainability became a public language, a German chemist named Hans von Pechmann accidentally discovered a strange white wax while heating diazomethane. Others would later refine that discovery into a material the modern world could scarcely live without: polyethylene. But alongside the rise of plastics came another possibility, one less celebrated and perhaps less convenient to the logic of mass consumption. As factories expanded and consumer culture accelerated, inventors and engineers learned a troubling truth. It was entirely possible to make products that lasted much longer than the market preferred. Light bulbs could burn longer. Mechanical parts could be strengthened. Packaging could be reused instead of discarded. Materials could be designed for endurance rather than replacement. The lost invention here was not a single device hidden in a drawer, but a broader path not taken, a world built around permanence rather than planned decay. There were moments when that alternate future almost came into focus. Early 20th century manufacturers knew how to create extremely long-lasting components. Some did. A few still survive in museums and forgotten buildings, quietly embarrassing the disposable age that followed. But durability collided with a powerful economic incentive. If goods lasted too long, sales slowed. If parts rarely failed, industries built on repetition and replacement began to wobble. So innovation did not stop. It changed direction. Intelligence was poured not only into making things work, but into deciding how long they should work. The science of endurance remained, but the culture around it shifted. What vanished from public imagination was the ideal of enoughness, the notion that technology might serve human life by asking less from it over time. This kind of disappearance is harder to dramatize because no single prototype was stolen, no lab was raided, no inventor collapsed beside an unfinished blueprint. And yet the loss may be just as profound. We inherited a civilization of abundance haunted by waste, surrounded by objects built to age faster than we do. When an invention promises longevity, it quietly challenges more than engineering. It challenges appetite, profit, and the rhythm of modern desire. And perhaps that is why some of the most consequential lost inventions are not the ones we never achieved, but the ones we learned to ignore. What if the most powerful fuel on Earth had once fit in the palm of a hand? In the early decades of the atomic age, when mushroom clouds darkened the public imagination, there were also quieter visions of nuclear power, visions that did not begin with war, but with abundance. Among them was the thorium reactor, an idea that glowed at the edge of possibility like an alternate branch of history. Thorium itself was not rare, not especially exotic, and not burdened at first with the same political gravity as uranium. Engineers and physicists saw in it a different kind of promise: reactors that could produce energy with less long-lived waste, lower risks of runaway catastrophe, and fewer materials easily diverted toward weapons. It was not a fantasy. Experimental work advanced. At Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the 1960s, Molten salt reactor research showed that another nuclear path was technically imaginable. But imagine is not the same as adopt. The machinery of the Cold War favored uranium and plutonium, materials bound not only to electricity, but to national strategy, military planning, and the terrifying arithmetic of deterrence. Governments did not merely choose an energy system. They chose an entire geopolitical architecture. Thorium, with its different fuel cycle and weaker link to bomb making, stood outside the main current of that decision. So the research was narrowed, deferred, and gradually pushed to the margins. Not erased completely, but filed away in reports, remembered by specialists, revived now and then by each new generation, asking whether the nuclear future could still be rewritten. In that sense, thorium became less an abandoned machine than an unopened armored door, one that remained visible long after the hallway had been built around another route. There is something deeply human in this pattern. We often imagine technology as the clean product of reason, as though the best idea naturally rises to the top. But inventions live inside history, and history is crowded with fear, urgency, rivalry, and compromise. The atom that might have lit cities more gently was born in the same century that taught nations to weaponize light itself. And so the question lingers. How many inventions are lost not because they fail the test of science, but because they fail the mood of their moment? What if a city could breathe through its own skin? In the 1930s and 1940s, as concrete climbed higher and skylines began to harden into symbols of progress, a different architectural imagination flickered at the edges of modernity. It came from dreamers, chemists, and engineers who believed buildings might one day do more than shelter human life. They might participate in it. They might collect sunlight, regulate heat, recycle water, and produce their own energy long before such ideas became fashionable enough to sell. Some of those concepts were astonishingly early. Passive solar design was explored well before the environmental movements of the late 20th century gave it mainstream urgency. Experimental homes used orientation, glass, thermal mass, and airflow to reduce the need for mechanical heating and cooling. Designers imagined structures that would work with nature rather than sealing people away from it. In another timeline, these ideas might have become the emotional foundation of urban life. But history took a different turn. Cheap fossil fuels, expanding suburbs, air conditioning, and industrial materials encouraged a built environment based on abundance rather than balance. If a room was too hot, machines would cool it. If winter pressed at the windows, furnaces would answer. Architecture no longer needed to negotiate with climate. It could overpower it, at least for those who could afford the bill. The deeper intelligence of building with the sun, the wind, and the land was not disproven. It was simply crowded out. The loss was subtle because pieces of the knowledge survived. In textbooks, prototypes, and occasional communities, the old principles endured like seeds waiting in dry ground. Yet for decades, the larger culture treated them as eccentric, idealistic, or impractical. Only later, as cities swelled and the atmosphere itself began to register upon, did those earlier visions return with renewed force. There is something humbling in that return. Sometimes the future is not invented once and for all. Sometimes it is proposed, ignored, and then rediscovered by descendants standing amid the consequences of forgetting. The sun never stopped rising over our roofs. The wind never stopped moving across our walls. So perhaps the real mystery is not how such ideas were lost, but why human beings so often wait for crisis before listening to wisdom that was already there, quietly falling through the light. What if the machine that changed the world was never the one we chose, but the one we overlooked? In the first years of the automobile, the roads did not belong to gasoline alone. They belonged to uncertainty. Steam cars hissed at the curb. Electric carriages moved with eerie quiet. Inventors argued not only over speed and power, but over the character of motion itself. The future had not yet decided what kind of sound it would make. Among those early possibilities, electric vehicles held a surprising grace. They were clean at the point of use, easier to operate, and far less temperamental than hand-cranked gasoline engines. In the cities of the early 20th century, where roads were short and charging could happen close to home, they made a certain kind of practical sense. For a brief moment, it was possible to imagine a modern world built on silence rather than combustion. But technologies do not compete on elegance alone. They compete inside landscapes. economies, and habits. As roads stretched outward, as oil became cheap and widely available, and as mass production lowered the cost of gasoline cars, the balance shifted. The electric car's limited range turned from manageable constraint to fatal weakness. Speed became a cultural value. Distance became a promise. The internal combustion engine, loud and dirty as it was, aligned itself with expansion, and expansion became the story of the century. So the electric car receded into memory, not as a failed fantasy, but as a path deferred. It survived in old photographs, in museum collections, in the faint astonishment of people who later discovered that the car of the future had once belonged to the past. The invention was not erased in a single dramatic moment. It was overshadowed by a world that preferred what gasoline could symbolize: freedom without pause, motion without waiting, progress measured by acceleration. Only much later, under the pressure of climate, cities, and finite resources, did the old idea return with new batteries and new language. And that return carries a quiet irony. Sometimes what seems revolutionary is not a fresh creation, but a delayed memory, an old answer resurfacing in a new emergency. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of every lost invention. Human beings do not always move in straight lines toward wisdom. Sometimes we circle back, discovering that the future we need was already parked at the curb, waiting for us to notice it. What if medicine once reached toward a gentler future, only to be pulled back by the weight of caution and profit? In the early 20th century, long before wellness became an industry, and long before modern pharmaceuticals reshaped the boundaries of illness, there were inventors and physicians exploring therapies that seemed to belong to another imagination. Some worked with light, some with magnetism, some with frequencies, heat, or electrical stimulation. Their devices filled clinics, catalogs, and hopeful conversations with the promise that the body might be influenced in subtler ways than surgery or chemical force alone. Not all of those methods were sound. Some were rooted in weak evidence, exaggerated claims, or the optimism of an era intoxicated by electricity itself. But others hinted at real principles that would later return in more disciplined forms: phototherapy, nerve stimulation, targeted electromagnetic treatments, rehabilitative devices that help the body recover by working with its own signals. The tragedy is that serious inquiry and empty spectacle often traveled side by side, making it difficult to separate the meaningful from the theatrical. As medicine professionalized, many of these inventions were swept into suspicion. Some deserved to be. The field needed standards, trials, and a way to protect people from charlatans. But in that necessary cleansing, certain possibilities may also have been discarded too quickly. Not because they lacked all value, but because they arrived in a noisy marketplace where credibility itself had become fragile. The result was not just the death of bad ideas. It was the narrowing of imagination. What vanished then was more than a cabinet of obsolete machines. It was a certain willingness to ask whether healing might come from forms of intervention less violent than the ones modernity often preferred. Only later did fragments return, refined by research, stripped of grandiose language, and reintroduced as respectable science. There is a lesson in that cycle. Human beings need skepticism, especially when pain makes us vulnerable to false hope. But we also need humility, because history shows how easily a culture can throw away a seed simply because it first appeared tangled in weeds. And perhaps the hardest task of any age is learning how to protect ourselves from deception without closing the door on wonder itself. What if the dream of endless energy did not begin in a secret bunker or a science fiction novel, but in the notebooks of respected physicists trying to understand the atom? In 1989, two chemists, Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, stood before the world and suggested something extraordinary: that nuclear fusion, the force that powers stars, might be produced at room temperature inside a laboratory cell. The phrase cold fusion entered public life like a spark in dry grass. For a brief and electric moment, the implications seemed almost unbearable in their scale. Energy without smokestacks, power without the immense heat and engineering burden of conventional fusion. A new century arriving ahead of schedule. Newspapers rushed forward, investors paid attention, governments listened. The public, already familiar with the promises and fears of nuclear science, found itself staring at a possibility that felt both miraculous and strangely intimate: as though the cosmos had folded itself into a tabletop experiment. Then came the unraveling. Laboratories across the world tried to reproduce the results and failed, or seemed to fail. The scientific mood turned sharply. What had been hailed as a revolution became, in the eyes of many, a cautionary tale about haste, publicity, and the unforgiving discipline of proof. Fleischmann and Pons were criticized not only for their claims, but for the manner of their announcement, which appeared to leap ahead of peer review and established process. In science, embarrassment can move as quickly as excitement, and yet the story did not end cleanly. A small community of researchers continued, arguing that anomalous effects still deserve patient study. Funding dried up, reputations hardened, and the field drifted into a borderland between fringe persistence and unresolved curiosity. The invention, if that is what it was, became nearly impossible to discuss without inheriting decades of mockery or misplaced hope. There is something deeply revealing in that arc. Human beings say they want breakthroughs, but breakthroughs arrive carrying disorder. They threaten not only what we know, but how we know it. And when an idea touches the boundary between error and transformation, perhaps the hardest question is not whether we were fooled, but whether our fear of being fooled can sometimes make us stop looking too soon. What if the most radical invention was not a machine at all, but a method for remembering what the Earth once knew? In the 19th and early 20th centuries, before satellites mapped the sky and computers modeled the climate, there were scientists, surveyors, and obsessive amateurs gathering fragments of a planetary memory. Ice cores, sediment layers, fossil pollen, tree rings, mineral traces. These were not yet part of a single elegant science. They were scattered clues collected by people who sensed that time had left fingerprints everywhere. At first, much of this work seemed too slow, too indirect, too humble to compete with the loud prestige of engines and factories. It did not promise immediate profit. It did not roar, glitter, or transform transportation overnight. It asked for patience, collaboration, and the difficult art of inference. Yet hidden inside those quiet measurements was a profound invention, a way to reconstruct lost worlds, to read climates, extinctions, droughts, migrations, and collapses long after the witnesses were gone. The tragedy is that this method of deep environmental memory was often undervalued until the modern world began to feel unstable beneath its own assumptions. Industrial societies built themselves on the belief that nature was background, a stage set rather than an active participant in history. The archive of Earth existed, but we lacked the cultural habit of listening to it. And so many early insights into ecological fragility were treated as curiosities instead of warnings. Nothing about this invention was truly erased. Its tools survived, its disciplines matured. But what disappeared for a long time was its moral force. The ability to know was present long before the willingness to change. Only later, as seasons shifted and old certainties thinned, did humanity begin to understand that reading the past was also a way of measuring the future. There is a haunting irony in that delay. We often imagine lost inventions as devices stolen from us, but some are lost in a quieter way. They remain available, proven, even visible, while their meaning goes unclaimed. And perhaps that is one of the saddest forms of forgetting. Not when knowledge vanishes, but when it survives and we still fail to hear what it is trying to say. What if the inventions we lose are sometimes the ones that ask the least from the earth? Scattered through the 20th century were designers, farmers, and engineers working on systems so modest they rarely looked like grand technology at all. Seed-saving tools, closed-loop agriculture, composting toilets, gray water systems, low-energy refrigeration, decentralized water purification, devices and methods built not to dominate nature, but to remain in conversation with it. These ideas emerged in many places at once, often far from the centers of prestige. Some came from wartime scarcity, when necessity forced households and communities to reuse, repair, and improvise. Others came from rural traditions that modern industry dismissed as backward, even while quietly depending on their resilience. The inventions themselves were practical, sometimes ingenious, and often inexpensive. Their weakness was not technical failure, it was cultural status. They did not flatter the fantasy that progress always means bigger systems, denser networks, and greater consumption. As the century advanced, centralized infrastructure became a symbol of modern life. Gigantic grids, massive treatment plants, industrial agriculture, refrigerated supply chains stretching across continents. These systems delivered extraordinary scale, but they also made smaller alternatives seem primitive by comparison. Solutions that were local, repairable, and adaptive were pushed aside, not because they lacked value, but because they did not match the emotional architecture of modern ambition. They felt too humble for an age in love with magnitude. And yet humility has a way of returning. In times of drought, blackout, conflict, and climate stress, people rediscover the intelligence of systems that can survive interruption. Suddenly, the old tools no longer look quaint. They look prescient. What was once dismissed as low-tech begins to reveal itself as another kind of sophistication, one measured not by spectacle, but by endurance. There is something deeply revealing in this reversal. Human beings often confuse complexity with wisdom, scale with success, but some inventions are valuable precisely because they reduce dependence, waste less, and ask us to live with greater awareness of limits. Perhaps the future will not only be built by breakthrough machines, perhaps part of it will be recovered from the patient, long-neglected craft of living well with less. What if the rarest invention is not a device, but a way of organizing human effort so that discovery serves everyone? Throughout modern history, some of the most promising breakthroughs did not disappear because the science failed. They faded because the structures around them could not sustain cooperation without turning it into competition. Laboratories guarded data. Corporations locked patents behind walls. Nations treated knowledge as strategic territory. And ideas that might have matured through shared stewardship were left stranded between ownership and neglect. This tension has haunted everything from medicine to energy to communication. An invention appears, and with it comes a question far larger than engineering. Who controls what happens next? Funding arrives with conditions. Institutions demand priorities. Investors seek returns on a timetable that curiosity does not always obey. The result is a quiet distortion of innovation itself. Researchers begin not only to ask what can be built, but what can be sold, protected, scaled, or weaponized. Possibility narrows, often invisibly, long before the public ever hears the story. In that sense, some lost inventions are casualties of isolation. Not because no one understood them, but because too few people were allowed to understand them together. The open exchange of methods, failures, and partial successes can be as important as the original insight. Without that ecosystem, brilliant work becomes fragile. It depends too heavily on one lab, one company, one charismatic inventor, one political season. When those conditions collapse, the invention goes dark without them. And yet history also offers another model, one that surfaces in moments of crisis or unusual generosity. Scientists collaborate across borders. Engineers publish designs freely. Communities adapt tools to local needs. Knowledge moves not as a private weapon, but as a shared inheritance. In those moments, invention becomes less about ownership and more about participation, a collective act of remembering what human intelligence can do when it is not divided against itself. Perhaps that is one of the most overlooked truths in the history of lost ideas. The fate of an invention depends not only on whether it works, but on whether a culture can make room for its flourishing. And maybe the future we keep searching for will require not just new machines, but new ways of trusting one another with what we learn. What if every lost invention is really a mirror, reflecting not only what was made, but what kind of civilization chose not to keep it? By now, the pattern begins to feel familiar. A new idea appears with the force of revelation. It offers cleaner power, quieter motion, longer life, gentler healing, deeper memory, or a wiser relationship with the world. For a moment, it seems possible that history might turn. And then the heavier forces arrive: money, fear, habit, rivalry, pride, delay. The invention does not always vanish in flames. More often, it is absorbed into the noise until its absence begins to feel normal. This may be the most unsettling part of the story. We like to imagine that progress is inevitable, that useful things naturally survive because their value is obvious. But history suggests something far more fragile. Human beings do not simply invent tools. We choose again and again which tools deserve a future. Those choices are shaped by our appetites, our institutions, our anxieties, and our imagination of what life is for. The machine matters, but the culture around the machine may matter even more. Seen this way, erased inventions are not only technical losses, they are moral and emotional records. They tell us what an age rewarded, what it dismissed, and what it could not yet bear to become. Some ideas arrived before infrastructure could support them. Some were flawed. Some were romanticized beyond reason. Yet even the imperfect ones reveal a profound human instinct, the refusal to believe that the present arrangement of life is the best we can do. And maybe that is why these stories continue to haunt us. Not because each forgotten invention would certainly have transformed the world, but because each one reminds us that history was never as fixed as it now appears. At every turning point, there were other roads, other engines, other systems of care and power waiting in the wings. So before this journey closes, one final question remains in the dim light between memory and possibility. If the past is full of futures that never happened, what responsibilities do we carry toward the ones that are still trying to begin? In the end, perhaps the most important question is not whether every lost invention was real, workable, or wrongly buried. The deeper question is what these stories reveal about us. Again and again, across workshops and laboratories, deserts and coastlines, hospital rooms and factory floors, human beings reach toward a different arrangement of life. They imagined power without so much ruin, tools that endured, systems that healed more gently, ways of building that listened to the planet instead of forcing it into silence. Whether those visions failed through error, resistance, timing, or neglect, they still testify to something enduring in the human spirit, our refusal to stop imagining better worlds. That may be the quiet thread connecting every chapter in this journey, not certainty, but longing, not proof of hidden destinies, but evidence of how often the future begins as a fragile act of hope. Many inventions disappear because the conditions around them are not yet ready. Some return decades later in altered form, welcomed at last by a world that has changed just enough to receive them. Others remain unresolved, half-lit ideas waiting in notebooks, patents, rumors, and forgotten shelves. Their power lies not only in what they could have done, but in the questions they continue to ask of the present. What do we reward? What do we overlook? Why do some possibilities capture the full machinery of belief, while others are left to drift at the edges of memory? These are not only questions about technology, they are questions about values, about institutions, about the stories civilizations tell themselves concerning progress, profit, safety, and meaning. An invention never enters an empty room. It arrives in a human world shaped by fear and desire, by urgency and blindness, by generosity and control. So maybe the true lesson of erased inventions is not to romanticize every forgotten machine, nor to surrender to suspicion, but to remain awake. Awake to the ideas that seem too humble, too early, too inconvenient, or too strange. Awake to the possibility that wisdom is sometimes dismissed before it is understood. And awake, above all, to the fragile responsibility of choosing which future deserves to live. Because memory is never just about the past. It is a way of deciding what we carry forward. And somewhere, even now in the mind of an unknown inventor or the margin of an overlooked paper, another quiet possibility is waiting to be believed.